Mr. Yates, your daughter still hasn't been picked up. It's been 4 hours. I was standing in the parking lot of a strip mall with a lock cylinder in my hand and a phone against my ear, and I laughed. I actually laughed because I assumed it was a wrong number and I was about to be helpful about it. I said, "Ma'am, I think you've got the wrong Yates. I don't have a daughter, I'm 35 and I'm single." And there was a pause on that line that I have thought about approximately 10,000 times since. And then the woman said, in a completely different voice, flat, careful, and very cold, "Sir, you are listed as the father. You are listed as the emergency contact. Your name, your date of birth, and your phone number are on this child's file. She has been sitting in this office since 2:15, so you can come now, or I am calling the police and reporting this as child neglect. Those are your options." And then she gave me the address of an elementary school I had never heard of, in a town 20 minutes from mine. I want you to understand my state of mind on that drive. I was not frightened, I was irritated, and I was confused, and I spent most of those 20 minutes composing the polite little speech I was going to give, that there'd been a clerical error, that somebody had put the wrong number in a system, that I was happy to help sort it out, but that I had a 2 o'clock and I'd already missed it. I parked, I walked in, I got buzzed through the front doors, I turned into the main office, and there was a little girl sitting on a plastic chair against the wall with a backpack in her lap, and she looked up, and her whole face changed, and she came off that chair and ran across that office and wrapped both arms around my legs, and she said, "Dad, where were you?" But I'm getting ahead of myself, and none of this means anything unless I tell it in order, because you need to understand how a man with no children ends up on a school emergency card, and who that little girl was, and what was in the envelope they handed me 40 minutes later. And I promise you right now, it's not what you're thinking. So stay with me. And if you've ever had your entire life reorganized by one phone call you almost didn't answer, hit that subscribe button before we go any further. Because this is the story of the worst afternoon of my life, and it is also the story of the best thing that has ever happened to me, and those turned out to be the same afternoon. Let me back up. My name is Ellis Yates. I'm 37 now. All of this happened 2 years ago when I was 35. I'm a locksmith. I've been one since I was 22. My uncle taught me and I bought his van off him when he retired, and I've been running it myself ever since. Residential and commercial, rekeys, lockouts, safes when I'm lucky. It's a strange job and I like it more than I can explain. Mostly, what I do is let people back into places they belong. That's the whole thing. Somebody is standing outside their own house in the rain, locked out of their own life, and I show up and I make it open. There's a woman I've let into the same apartment 4 separate times, and she apologizes every time, and I always tell her the same thing, which is that this is literally the job. Before all this, my life was, I want to be honest and not dress it up. Small, not sad, small. I had the van and a 2-bedroom I rented, and a dog named Rooster who was a coward. I played in a bad Tuesday night pool league. I saw my sister and her kids about twice a month. My sister asked me once, maybe a year before all this, whether I wanted kids. And I gave her the answer I'd been giving for a decade, which was, yeah, probably, someday. And she said, "Ellis, you're 34. And I said, "I know." And the truth, which I did not say to her and had barely said to myself, was that I'd quietly stopped believing it. Not decided against it, just stopped picturing it. There's a specific age where the someday stuff moves from a plan to a thing you say, and I'd crossed it without noticing. I was 35 years old, I hadn't been in a serious relationship in about 4 years, and I had reached the point where I'd stopped assuming certain things were going to happen for me. I want to be clear that I wasn't miserable. I've read enough of these stories to know they usually start with a man in ruins, and I wasn't. I was fine. I was just running level. Nothing was coming. Now let me tell you about Juny. Juny Farrow. I met her when I was 27 years old and she was 23, and we were together for about 1.5 years, and I want to tell you plainly that she was the best thing in my 20s, and I did not have the sense to understand that at the time. She was a barrel of a person. That's the only way I can put it. Loud laugh, terrible taste in music, absolutely no filter, cried at commercials. She worked as a dental hygienist and hated it, and was extremely funny about hating it. She used to leave notes in my toolbox, just dumb ones, "Don't lose the little screwdriver," with a drawing of a screwdriver. And I'd find them 3 days later on a job and have to go sit in the van for a minute. I'll give you one thing about her because I want her to be a person in this and not just a plot. Juny had a rule that if either of us was in a bad mood, we had to go to the grocery store. That was it. That was the whole intervention. Not talk about it, not work through it, go to the Kroger on Delmar and walk every aisle and not buy anything except one thing each that the other person had to approve. And it worked. It worked every single time, and I have never understood why. I have been in that grocery store maybe 40 times in the last 2 years, and I have never once made it past the produce without having to stand there for a second. We were together a year and a half and then it ended, and here's exactly how, because it matters enormously. I got offered a job, a real one, a big commercial security outfit 2 states away, salaried, benefits, the whole thing. I was 28 and I'd been scraping along and it felt like the thing I was supposed to want. And we had the conversation you have. And Juny was 24, and her mother was sick at the time and she couldn't leave, and I said come out in 6 months, and she said maybe, and we both knew. And I left. And we did the long-distance thing badly for about 6 weeks, and then it just stopped. Nobody ended it. There wasn't a fight. It thinned out into nothing, the way things do at that age, and I told myself I'd call her when things settled down. I never called her. That's it. That's the whole crime. I was 28 and I was busy and I told myself there was time. The job, by the way, was terrible. I lasted 14 months and came home and started my own van, which is what I should have done in the first place. Now, here's the part I did not know for 7 years. Juny found out she was pregnant 3 weeks after I left. 3 weeks. And she tried to tell me. She did try. And I want to walk through exactly what happened. Because when I finally learned it, it took me about a month to be able to think about it without having to sit down. She called the number she had for me, but the number she had was the work line at my old shop, because that's where I'd always been reachable, and I'd left that shop, and the guy who answered told her he didn't know where I'd gone. So she wrote a letter, and she sent it to my mother's house because that was the only permanent address she'd ever known for me. My mother had died 14 months earlier. The house had been sold. That letter came back, and Juny Farrow was 24 years old, pregnant, with a sick mother, holding a returned envelope. And she took it as an answer. I've spent 2 years trying to be angry at her about that, and I cannot get there. Because I know what it looked like from where she was standing. It looked like a man who left, stopped calling, changed his number, and vanished. It looked like a man who had made himself unreachable on purpose. And she was proud. God, she was proud. That woman would not have chased somebody who didn't want to be found, not for anything, not even for that. So she stopped trying, and she had a baby by herself in April, and she named her Poppy, and she raised her alone for 6 years. Now, the phone call. It was a Thursday in October. I was on a job in a strip mall, rekeying a nail salon that had changed hands, and my phone rang with a number I didn't know, and I almost let it go to voicemail, and I want you to sit with that for a second because I very nearly did. And a woman said, "Is this Ellis Yates?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Mr. Yates, your daughter still hasn't been picked up. It's been 4 hours." And I laughed at her. I've apologized to Doreen Halstead about that laugh probably 9 times. She is the office administrator at that school, and she has been for 19 years, and she is one of the great people of this earth. And I have never in my life been more wrong about the tone of a conversation. Because from where she sat, she'd had a 6-year-old in her office since 2:15. She'd called the mother's number 9 times, straight to a deadline. She'd called the father's number, which she'd been calling all afternoon. And finally a man picked up and laughed at her and said he didn't have a daughter. She thought I was a man abandoning a child. She was completely right to threaten me. If she hadn't, I don't know how this ends. So I drove. And I'll tell you the truth about that drive. About 12 minutes in, somewhere on the highway, my irritation dropped out from under me and something else took its place. Because I had started doing arithmetic, the woman had said the file listed my date of birth. Not just a name. A wrong number is a wrong number, but nobody accidentally types a stranger's birthday. And once I'd thought that, I thought, how old is the kid? And then I thought about Juny Farrow for the first time in probably 2 years, and I did not think about her fondly or nostalgically. I thought about her with a kind of cold dread, the way you think about a step you might have missed in the dark 7 years ago. I did not let myself finish the thought. I want to be honest about that. I had the whole thing available to me on that highway, and I actively refused to complete it, because there was a version of the next 20 minutes where it was a clerical error, and I wanted to stay in that version as long as possible. And I did one other thing on that drive that I've never told anybody, which is that at a red light about 4 minutes out, I pulled up my own contacts and I scrolled to the F's. Her name was still in there. Juny Farrow. 7 years, 3 phones, and it had migrated through every backup like a splinter working its way out. I looked at it for the length of a green light, and somebody honked at me. I did not call it. And I've thought about that too, because if I had, I'd have gotten a disconnected tone, and I'd have walked into that office already knowing something was very wrong. Instead, I walked in with nothing. I parked crooked. I remember that. There's a visitor lot and I took up 2 spaces and I didn't fix it. I got buzzed in. There's that thing now where you have to look at a camera and state your business. And I said something like, I got a call about a student, and the door clicked, and I walked down a hallway that smelled like every elementary school in America. Floor wax and paste, and something faintly like oranges. And I turned into the office. And there was a little girl on a plastic chair by the wall, 6 years old. Dark hair that had been in braids that morning and had substantially given up. A backpack on her lap with both arms around it. Sneakers not touching the floor. And she had been crying at some point and had stopped, which is worse if you've ever seen a kid do it. And she looked up when I came in. And I watched her whole face come apart and reassemble into something I did not have any preparation for, which was pure, uncomplicated relief. And she was off that chair before anybody said anything, and she came across that office at a dead run, and she hit my legs and wrapped both arms around them and pressed her face into my knee, and she said, "Dad, where were you?" I want to try to describe what happened in me, and I've never once managed it properly, because here's the thing nobody warns you about. My body knew before I did. My hands came down onto that child's shoulders before my brain had approved of anything. Some part of me that does not consult the rest of me had already decided something. And I stood in the middle of that office with the 6-year-old attached to my legs and my hands on her back. And I looked over the top of her head at Doreen Halstead, and I said the stupidest sentence of my entire life. I said, I think there's been a mistake. And I watched that woman's face change, because she saw my face, and she'd been doing her job for 19 years, and she understood in about a second and a half that whatever was happening here was not what she'd thought was happening. And she said, very carefully, "Poppy, honey, can you sit with Mrs. Ruiz for a minute? Mr. Yates and I need to talk in my office." And the girl said, "Okay." And then she looked up at me and said, "Are you coming back?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm not going anywhere." And I want to tell you one more thing about that office because it's the detail that has stayed with me hardest. When she let go of my legs and stepped back to look up at me, she did something with her face. She sort of checked me. Her eyes went over my face very fast, the way you check that a thing matches a picture. And then she nodded, slightly, to herself. At the time, I had absolutely no idea what that was, and it unsettled me badly. I understand it now. She had been looking at a 7-year-old photograph of a man standing next to a van for months, every night, and she was confirming. A 6-year-old ran a facial recognition check on me in an elementary school office, and I passed. And that is the first promise I ever made to my daughter, and I made it about 9 seconds after meeting her. And I did not know at the time that it was going to be extremely difficult to keep. In that office, Doreen showed me the file. My name, spelled right. My date of birth. My cell number, my current one, the one I'd had for 4 years. Relationship, father. And under the mother's information, Juny Farrow with an address and a phone number. And there was a note in the file, dated 11 days earlier, in the handwriting of the school nurse that said the mother had called to advise that she was ill and that the father would be handling pickups going forward. 11 days earlier. And I said, "Where is she? Where's Juny?" And Doreen Halstead said they'd been trying that number all afternoon and it was disconnected, and that they'd had no contact since that call. And I sat in a chair that was slightly too small for me, And I read that file about 6 times, and I want to tell you what was going through my head, because it was not what you'd expect. It was not, is she mine? I had already stopped asking that one, somewhere between the parking lot and the doorway. I'd seen her face. What I was actually thinking over and over on a loop was, she's 6. She's been 6 for a while, which means she was 5, which means she was 4 and 3 and 2 and 1, and there was a day she was born and I was somewhere. I was probably on a job. I was probably standing in somebody's driveway with a drill. That's what I sat in that office thinking. Not the question. The arithmetic of everything I'd already missed while it was happening 20 minutes away. And she said, "Mr. Yates, I have to ask you directly. Are you this child's father?" And I said, "I don't know." I want to tell you what happened over the next 4 hours, because this is the part that most people get wrong when they imagine this story, and I think the reality of it is important. Nobody let me take that child home. I want to say that clearly, because I've had people tell this story back to me and skip straight from the hug to a happy ending, and that is not how it works, and it should not be how it works. A school cannot release a child to a man who has just said the words, "I don't know," about whether he's her father. Child Protective Services was called. A police officer came, and she was decent and thorough and asked me the same 6 questions 8 different ways. A caseworker arrived at about 6 in the evening. Her name is Renata Cho, and she is another one of the great people of this earth. And she did an emergency intake in a room with a very small table. And they went looking for Juny Farrow. They found her that night. Juny had died 11 days earlier, cancer. She was 31 years old. She'd been sick for about a year and a half, and the last stretch had been fast. And here is what she had done in her final months, and I need a second every time I get to this part. She found me. I don't know exactly how. Renata thought probably just the internet, because I'm a locksmith with a van that has my phone number painted on the side, and I am not a hard man to find if you actually look. Juny had spent 6 years not looking, because she believed I'd made myself unfindable on purpose. And then she got a diagnosis, and she looked, and it took her about an afternoon. And she did not call me. She put me on every form: school enrollment, emergency contact, medical release. She called the school nurse 11 days before she died and said the father would be handling pickups. And she told Poppy about me, every night for months. Renata found out later from Juny's sister that Juny had a photograph of me, one photo, 7 years old, of me standing next to my old van, and she showed it to that little girl over and over and told her that this was her dad, and that he was a good man, and that he fixed locks, and that one day he was going to come and get her. That's why she ran across the office. She'd been looking at my face for months. She knew exactly who came through that door, and on the day Juny died, her sister Bex, who lives 4 hours away and has 3 kids of her own, and who I want to say was not a villain in any of this, she was drowning. Bex took Poppy for 11 days, and then Bex put her on the school bus on a Thursday morning and went home and did not come back. Bex told me about the last few months, eventually, when we got to a place where she could. Juny kept working until about 9 weeks before the end, because she had to, and because she was Juny. She did the whole thing at home with hospice for the last stretch, and she spent that time doing 2 jobs at once, dying and building a landing pad. She wrote out everything: Poppy's routines, what she eats, what she absolutely will not eat, the name of the stuffed rabbit, and the fact that it has to be washed on cold or it goes stiff and Poppy notices. Which foot goes in the sock first, because there's an order and it matters. 9 pages of it. Bex gave me those 9 pages the week Poppy came home, and I read them in the van in a parking lot, and then I couldn't drive for a while. That woman knew she was going to lose, and she spent her last months writing an instruction manual for a man she wasn't sure would show up. I've spoken to Bex a lot since. What she says, and I believe her, is that Juny told her exactly what she was doing and made her promise. That the plan was always that Poppy would be at that school on that Thursday, and that they would call me. Juny engineered it. Deliberately, down to the day. And I could not understand why. For weeks, I could not understand why a woman would do that to a child, and to me, instead of just picking up a telephone. And then, about 10 days later, Renata Cho handed me an envelope. Bex had it. Juny had written it, and given it to her sister with instructions that it go to me, but only after I'd been to the school. Only after. I've read that letter probably 200 times. It's 4 pages. I'm not going to read you the whole thing because parts of it are mine and Poppy's and that's it. But I'll tell you the part that answers the question. She wrote, "I know what you're going to ask, so here it is. I couldn't call you, Ellis. I sat with the phone about 40 times, and every single time I got as far as imagining you saying no. A nice no, a sorry, a this is a lot to put on me, and I couldn't survive it. I'm dying, and I couldn't survive 9 seconds of a phone call. That's how much of a coward I turned into. So I did it this way because I know you. I know that you are useless at saying no to something that's standing in front of you. You'll talk yourself out of anything at a distance, and you have never once walked past somebody who needed help. So I put her in front of you. It's not fair, I know it isn't. I'm doing it anyway because she's 6 and I'm out of time, and I would do considerably worse things than this for her. Look at her face and then decide. There's another part I'll share because I think it's the truest thing anybody said in this entire story. She wrote, "Here's what I need you to understand about her. She is not a sad kid. I know that's going to be hard to believe when you meet her, because you're going to meet her on the worst day of her life. But that is not who she is. She is loud, and she is bossy, and she thinks she's funnier than she is, which she gets from you. Don't handle her like she's broken. She's not broken. She's going to be sad for a long time, which is different. And the sad part is going to want you to treat her like glass, and you have to not do that. Just be normal at her. She'll do the rest. She's better at this than both of us." And then, at the bottom of the last page, she wrote, "I'm sorry I stopped trying. That was mine. I've had a long time to think about it, and it was mine. Now, let me tell you about the next 11 weeks because I think this is the most useful part of this whole story for anybody who's ever imagined being in a situation like this. It was hard. It was so much harder than people think. That night, the first night, Poppy did not come home with me. She went into an emergency placement with a licensed foster family about half an hour away, and I sat in my truck in a parking lot afterward, and I don't think I've ever felt worse in my life. Because I had promised her I wasn't going anywhere, roughly 4 hours earlier, and then I had gone somewhere. Renata explained it to me, and she was right. She said, "Mr. Yates, right now you are a man who says he might be her father. I cannot place a child based on might. Let's make you certain, and let's make you approved, and then we'll talk." So here's what it actually took. A DNA test, a real one, legal chain of custody, both of us swabbed in a lab, identification checked, the kind that stands up in a court, not the kind you order online. 9 days for the result. She's mine. 99.9 something. I got that call at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and I sat down on the floor of my own hallway. But that was not the end. That was the beginning of the paperwork. Because being biologically somebody's father does not automatically make you a legal parent when you've never been on a birth certificate, and it does not make you an approved caregiver. There was a paternity action. There was a background check. There was a home study, which meant a very pleasant woman came to my rented 2-bedroom and looked in my refrigerator and asked me about my smoke detectors in my pool league, and whether I understood what a grieving 6-year-old was going to be like. I had to get a second bedroom set up. I had to take a parenting course, which I resented for about 10 minutes and then found genuinely useful. I had to demonstrate income and a stable schedule, which for a self-employed man with a van is not nothing. And through all of it, I got supervised visits twice a week, in a room with beanbags in it, for an hour. Those hours were the strangest and best of my life. I'd never spent time with a 6-year-old in my life outside of my sister's kids at holidays. I did not know what to do, so I did the only thing I know how to do, which is that I brought my tools. Second visit, I brought a padlock and a little practice cylinder, and I showed her how a pin tumbler works. And that kid, 6 years old, 11 days after losing her mother, sat there for 45 minutes with her tongue between her teeth trying to get 5 pins to set. She got 2. She was outraged. She asked me to bring it again next time. That was the first time I thought, okay, we might be all right. I want to tell you about visit 6 because that's the one that broke me open. We were in the beanbag room, and she was working the practice cylinder, and she stopped, and she didn't look up, and she said, Did you know about me? 6 years old, straight through the middle of it. And I had about 2 seconds to decide whether to lie to my daughter, and I have never been more tempted by anything in my life, because the true answer sounds exactly like a man who didn't care. And I said, no, I didn't. Your mom tried to tell me a long time ago and it didn't work, and I didn't find out until the day I came to your school. And I'm really sorry, because if I'd known, I would have been there the whole time. And she thought about that for a while. And then she said, okay, and went back to the lock. And about 4 minutes later, without looking up, she said, you can come the whole time now. I got out to the parking lot before I lost it. Barely, 11 weeks. That's how long from the office to the day I brought her home. 11 weeks of visits and paperwork and a court date and a woman checking my smoke detectors. And I want to say something to anybody watching this who thinks that sounds like too much red tape. It isn't. Every single one of those steps exists because somewhere, at some point, a child got handed to somebody who should not have had them. I was frustrated every day, and I was wrong to be. Renata Cho was not an obstacle. She was doing the most important job there is, and she did it exactly right. Now, the honest rest of it, because these stories always want to end at the front door, and the front door is where it starts. The first night she came home, I had done everything I could think of. New bedding she'd picked, a night light, her mother's photo, already up on the wall by the bed, because Renata told me to have it there before she walked in, not after. And she went around that apartment very slowly, looking at everything, not touching much. And she got to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Just opened it and looked in it and shut it again. And I said, you hungry? And she said no. I found out weeks later from her therapist what that was. Kids who've had an unstable stretch check the refrigerator. Not because they're hungry, they're finding out whether there's going to be food. It's a survey. There is now a whiteboard on my refrigerator that lists what's in it, because she can read it from the doorway without having to open it, and because a therapist told me that letting a kid confirm something without asking is worth more than 100 reassurances. It's been 2 years. She still checks it. Less. But she checks. The first year was hard. I want to be extremely clear about that because I think there's a fantasy version of this where a man's life is transformed by a child and everything is warm, and the reality had a lot of 3 a.m. in it. Poppy did not arrive as a delightful gift. Poppy arrived as a 6-year-old who had watched her mother die and then been left at a school. She had nightmares for about 7 months. She had a stretch around month 3 where she got extremely angry at me, which her therapist, she had one, immediately, that was non-negotiable, said was actually a very good sign, because it meant she felt safe enough to be angry. She asked me once in the car, in the most casual voice you can imagine, "Are you going to send me back?" And I had to pull over. And there was a thing she did for about the first 4 months where she would follow me from room to room. Not clingy. She wasn't holding on. She'd just relocate. I'd go into the kitchen, and about 90 seconds later she'd wander in with a book and sit on the floor. I'd go out to the van, she'd come out and sit on the step. I mentioned it to her therapist, worried about it. And that woman said, "She's checking that you're still there. She'll stop when she believes you." She stopped around month 5, and I want to tell you about my own part in it because I don't want to come off better than I was. I was terrible at it for a while. I did not know how to do hair, and I still don't, really, and I've made peace with the fact that this child goes to school looking like she was raised by a locksmith, which she is. I got the school snack policy wrong 4 times. I let her watch something she should not have watched, and she had nightmares for a week, and that was entirely my fault. I also, for about the first 2 months, was grieving a woman I hadn't seen in 7 years, in secret, in a house with her daughter in it. And I did not handle that well, and I didn't tell anybody about it until I finally got myself into a chair across from somebody and paid them to listen. Poppy is 8 now. She's in the 3rd grade. She is loud like her mother and stubborn like her mother. And she has Juny's exact laugh, which is a thing I was not prepared for, and which still occasionally takes the legs out from under me in a grocery store. Doreen Halstead, the woman who threatened to call the police on me, comes to Poppy's birthday. Every year, both years. She was at that office at 7:40 on the night of the intake. Still, 4.5 hours after her shift ended, because she would not leave until she knew where that child was sleeping. I tried to thank her properly once and she got very brisk about it, and told me she'd been doing this a long time and that most of these do not go this way, and then she changed the subject to parking. I want that on the record somewhere, so Doreen Halstead is the reason this story exists. If she'd been the kind of person who takes a no on the phone and files a form, my daughter goes into the system and I never know she was born. She can pick a basic padlock. I'm aware of the risks. Her school is aware of the risks. We have a photograph of Juny on the wall in the hallway and one in her room by the bed, and we talk about her all the time. Not carefully, not in a special voice, just normally, the way you talk about somebody who's part of the family. That was the therapist's advice, and it's the best advice I got. Her mother is not a wound we tiptoe around. Her mother is a person we both love who isn't here. Bex. And her kids come down 4 or 5 times a year. That took some work on both sides, and it was worth every bit of it. Those are Poppy's cousins, and I was not going to let my discomfort cost her family. She calls me Dad. She has since the first second, obviously, and it never wobbled, not once. Not even during the angry stretch in month 3 when she was furious at me. Even then it was, "I hate you, Dad," which her therapist told me I should take as a compliment, and which I have chosen to. She asked me, about a year in, whether she should call me something else, whether Dad was right, given everything. And I told her that was completely up to her and she could change it any time and I'd never mind. And she said, "No, Mom said that's what you were, so that's what I am." It was decided by somebody else in another house, at night, over a photograph, before I ever knew about it. I just got told late. And Rooster the coward dog sleeps in her room now, and has completely forgotten I exist, which is fine. I sold the van, by the way, the old one. Bought a newer one with a back seat that fits a booster properly. My phone number is still painted on the side. Juny found me off that van, I'm fairly sure. I'm keeping it painted for as long as I'm working. Here's what I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. I spent 6 years being a man that a phone call could have found. That's the thing that sits with me. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't in another country. I was 20 minutes away, in the same county, with my phone number painted on the side of a vehicle in 12-inch letters, driving around, letting strangers back into their houses. And I know what some of you are thinking because I've thought it at 3 in the morning more times than I can count. She could have tried harder. She could have found me. 6 years is a lot of not trying. And that's true. It is completely true, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this tidier. But here's what I've landed on, and it took me about a year to get here. She was 24 and pregnant, and her mother was dying, and she got one returned envelope, and she made a decision in the worst week of her life, and then had to keep living inside that decision every day for 6 years. And every year that went by made it harder to undo, because how do you call a man after 4 years? After 5, what do you even say? I've done the same thing with much smaller stakes. Everybody has. There's a call you don't make, and then not making it becomes the thing, and the not making calcifies. She wasn't cruel. She was 24, and then she was stuck. And a woman I loved raised our daughter alone for 6 years, because one letter came back, and one shop said they didn't know where I'd gone. That's it. That's the whole distance between the life I had and the life I have. 1 returned envelope, and 2 people who were both too proud to try a second time. So, if there is anybody watching this who has somebody they've lost track of, not lost track of, somebody where it thinned out and nobody ended it, and you keep telling yourself there's time, and you'll call when things settle down, please call them. Today. I'm serious. Because I told myself there was time for 7 years, and there was, right up until there wasn't. And the cost of that was that I missed my daughter's entire childhood, up to age 6, and my kid's mother died believing I hadn't wanted to be found. I got extraordinarily lucky. A dying woman engineered my second chance for me with about 11 days to spare. Most people don't get that. Most people just get the returned envelope. And the last thing. That little girl ran across an office and grabbed my legs and said, "Dad, where were you?" And she meant that afternoon. She meant, "Where were you? At 2:15, I've been waiting on this chair." But I've never been able to hear it as only that. I hear the other question underneath it, the one she was too small to know she was asking. And I've spent 2 years answering it the only way it can be answered, which is not with an explanation. It's just by being there at 2:15 every single day, until she stops needing to check. So let me ask you something, and I really do read these. Is there somebody in your life you've lost track of? Not through a fight, just through time and busyness and telling yourself you'd get to it. Who is it? I'd like you to say their name in the comments, honestly. Sometimes writing it down is the thing that makes a person pick up the phone, and I would very much like this video to be responsible for a few of those. And this one too. Has your life ever been completely reorganized by one phone call, or one letter, or one thing you almost didn't answer? Tell me what happened. I nearly let that call go to voicemail. I think about that more than anything else in this whole story. If this one meant something to you tonight, do me that favor from the start, hit subscribe and stay with me. There's another one coming, and it's a good one.